Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Nature Live. I'm Alison. I'm your host for today's event. Can I ask you to raise your hand if this is your first time to a Nature Live talk? Wow. Okay, that's fantastic. Brilliant. That's most of us. In that case, I'll just briefly explain what we're all about. So Nature Live happens every Friday, Saturday and Sunday at the museum. And we are usually a chance for our visitors to meet one of the scientific staff that works behind the scenes here at the museum, because we are a very active research institute with a vast collection. And we do like to get our scientists out into the public eye talking about their research. However, today's event is a little bit different. Now, as many of you may know, we have currently out in the exhibition halls our fantastic Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition. Have any of you been to that by any chance? Pop your hand up. Excellent, that's what I like to see. If you haven't already, you really should go and take a look. It's a fantastic exhibition. Today, I'm very delighted to be joined by Paddy, who is a finalist in our Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition. He's going to be telling us all about his work. We've got some fantastic photographs that we're going to show you. Now, I should say before we start, we're very, very informal. I've got lots of questions for Paddy here, but we really do want to hear from you as well. So please, please don't be shy. If you have a question at any point, raise your hand or call out if we don't spot you, and we'll try to answer those for you. Now, Paddy, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today.
No, I thought it's a pleasure.
Now, you're a finalist in this year's exhibition, and was this the first time you'd ever entered?
It was actually, yeah. I'd sort of, it was one of the things that'd been on my list to do, and I kept never getting round to doing it. You sort of think, oh no, there's no point. It'll never sort of, your photos will never make it through. And so, yeah, and the year before last, yeah, I finally got down to doing it, and thank goodness I did.
Absolutely, to make it into the exhibition first time, that's impressive.
Yeah, should maybe not enter any more and leave it 100% record, but no.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into photography?
Yeah, I sort of started work as a cameraman, and then later sort of got into photography as a job, but had always been interested in photography. I come from, sort of my family is quite artistic. My mum and all her 6 sisters are all artists, so on family holidays there was always somebody out with a sketchbook. And I think you get used to sort of looking at landscapes as a picture and sort of seeing how they work.
And your work has really taken you all over the world, hasn't it, to some fairly exotic locations. Tell us some of the places you've been.
Yeah, I've been very lucky. Quite often it's the cold places I end up getting sent to, so Greenland, Antarctica, the Himalayas. But occasionally somewhere that's not quite so cold as a bit of a holiday, but more often than not, I'm packing my down jacket.
And many of these places, they look like they require quite a bit of effort to get to. Is that kind of challenge, is that important to you in your work?
I think I'm definitely drawn to remote places and enjoy the feeling of sort of getting to remote places. I think you can get quite addicted to being on expedition, where sort of there's so many distractions in everyday life that then disappear once you're on expedition. It becomes about only sort of getting the shots for that day, and depending where you are, getting through the day safely, and that I think can be quite addictive. And I think that's maybe what I try and communicate with some of the images.
Now let's take a look at your entry to this year's exhibition. It's absolutely beautiful, The Unstoppable Force. Talk us through this image. Where was it taken?
So this is taken in Pakistan, in the Himalayas, up near the Indian border. A friend, John Griffiths, who's a very good climber, had asked me along to follow him and Andy Houseman, another British climber, on their expedition to climb a mountain called Link Sar, which was previously unclimbed. But they were there. I think John was his 4th attempt and Andy his 2nd attempt to try and climb it. So an incredibly difficult climb. And just as we sort of got up there to base camp, there was a huge amount of snow, which was the last thing they needed or wanted, because their climb started up a north face. And then they'd have a long traverse along a ridge. So they needed everything to be as clear of snow as possible. So we started every 2 or 3 days going up the valley to see how the conditions were. And the mountain that this avalanche has come down is K6. which sort of sits at the head of the valley, dominating the area around. And while they were looking at Link Sar, sort of the other side of the mountain, I was able to the valley. I was able to sit and watch the sort of avalanches releasing from the face of K6.
What a sight to, and a sound probably to experience as well. Must have been
yeah,
amazing.
it was incredible. What's quite strange is they because the mountain's so big, they look like they're moving quite slowly down their face, although they're moving at sort of hundreds of kilometers an hour. So you have quite a lot of time to sort of frame up your picture. And I actually sort of got 4 or 5 frames of this one as it came down. It's an incredible sight, yeah.
It's absolutely beautiful. Now, presumably you are far enough away to be out of danger, but were there many avalanches in the area?
Yeah, that's on a reasonably long lens, but even around base camp when we first got up there, because of this amount of snow, there were avalanches releasing sort of all over the place. And my first few nights at base camp definitely saw every sound of an avalanche. I'd be out of the tent in my pants, ready to run down the valley to try and escape it. And then after a bit, you realise that, yeah, maybe it's not quite so dangerous.
You can relax,
a bit,
yeah. I can't say I blame you. But it's incredibly awe-inspiring. I get a real sense of awe when I look at these images. Is that something that you were trying to communicate?
I hope so, yeah. Again, I think it's that sort of feeling of awe and sort of human fragility that I think is you get from being in landscapes like this or Antarctica or sort of anywhere, even Greenland. And I think that's something that I try and communicate through my photos, definitely.
We've got another fantastic example here. What are we looking at?
So yeah, this is Descent. This is actually on the same expedition. And this is John and Andy. You can see the 2 figures sort of dwarfed by the Himalayan landscape there. They'd been up on acclimatizing on a nearby mountain called Sulu Peak. You see the shadow of that on the left. And then on the right is the debris of an avalanche. And they're coming down from having spent the night on the mountain. And I was sort of on a nearby ridge, had spent the night on a nearby ridge and was sort of looking down on them as they came down the mountain.
It's a phenomenal sight. Have you always been quite an adventurous person?
I think so, yeah. I sort of grew up on stories of Nansen, Scott, Amundsen, and particularly Shackleton. And so, yeah, I think the idea that you could have a job where you get to travel to these places sort of maybe seemed not that possible, but to be able to do it now is an incredible experience. And
you've been lucky enough to go to Antarctica as well, haven't you? So how did this come about?
This was an expedition to raise awareness of the Antarctic Treaty that comes up when it comes up for renewal. There's quite a lot of worry that countries might be allowed to start mining in Antarctica and exploiting its resources, which could have devastating consequences for the ecosystem. And so this was an expedition to raise awareness of that. The idea was to film 2 skiers here, Parker and Doug, doing the fastest skiing getting the fastest time skiing from the coast to the pole, and then also before that collecting ice core samples as we crossed Antarctica to try and give an idea of how climate change is affecting the interior of Antarctica. Because I think there's a lot of work done on the coast and people realise what's going on the coast, but not so much in the interior.
It's the harshest of environments, though, isn't it? What are some of the key challenges? We've got a bit of film footage, actually, from this expedition. If we could play that. What are the key challenges of actually working in this environment?
I think, obviously, the cold. The first thing everyone thinks about is the cold. Not on this expedition, but another expedition, we got down to -56, which is just brutal to be trying to work in that. But what people aren't maybe aware is the altitude at Antarctica. The South Pole is about 2,800 meters, so about twice the height of Snowdon. And the plateau sits above a lot of the plateau sits above 4,000 meters, so about the height of Mont Blanc. And then on top of that, I think this is how it works, but the spinning of the Earth thins the air at the poles by about 20%. So you have an added thing of feeling the altitude. And definitely when you first get up onto the plateau, you definitely feel the altitude, and it takes you a bit of time to get used to that and yeah, acclimatise.
It's so impressive. It's so impressive. Another thing that I hadn't appreciated about Antarctica is just what a vast, flat kind of plain the plateau can be. Was that quite disorienting?
It is. I mean, yeah, this is the two skiers in a whiteout. You can see how disorientating that would be with the white snow and just mist and cloud around you. But it's once you... normally the sort of mountains in Antarctica tend to be around the coast. And once you leave the coast and leave the mountains behind, it does become quite monotonous. All you've got is, even on a clear day, you've just got ice stretching as far as you can see, and then the sky, and it can become quite monotonous. The sort of, it's a bit like being at sea. You have sastrugi. I think there's a video of one of the truck sort of crossing sastrugi, which the waves of ice basically carved out by the Antarctic winds that can be here, that sort of you can see some of them, but they can be up to 1.5 meters tall. So it sort of creates a maze that you have to thread your way through as you're crossing the plateau. Yeah. So the things that go the things that struggle in the cold are the LCD screen. Quite often that's one of the first things to go. It sort of lags behind, so you're sort of seeing what you filmed 30 seconds ago, which is quite difficult sometimes. And then the batteries, the big problem is batteries. So sometimes you have a sort of lead that you can put the battery in your jacket, and then it leads to the camera so that the battery is slightly warmer. But I've had times of sort of had batteries in the charger in my sleeping bag, trying to desperately get them warm enough to charge, because they won't charge if they're too cold. So yeah, it can be a bit of a nightmare.
As presumably the clothing that you've got to wear as well is quite bulky, and the gloves, that can't be easy.
Yeah, especially when you're filming, you tend to just leave the camera on record and just realise that you'll edit out all the other stuff in between, because if something's happening and you can't hit record with your big gloves, then that's a bit of a nightmare. Yeah.
Did we have any other questions from our audience at all? No. Oh.
Sorry. Going back to the avalanche, were you taking hundreds of shots, basically?
No, so I probably took about probably 8 frames of the avalanche as it came down, and probably about sort of 5 of them were quite good. You know, a couple looked the same. Yeah, so again, it's quite a... You sort of think of an avalanche coming down as quite a quick thing, but because the K6, this mountain, it's just over 7,000 meters high, and obviously that's from sea level, but the relief of that is something like 3,000 meters from the valley floor. So it's it happens quite slowly. Since it looks very sedate when it's happening.
Do we have a question over here?
How cold is Antarctica? So it varies quite a lot. You get anything from about -15 to -56, or you get colder than that. That's the temperatures I experienced. But it's strange, in Antarctica it can be -15 or -20, and because the sun's very strong, if there's no wind, it can feel quite warm. And so actually what I've done in -18 in Antarctica is you can give yourself a bath in the snow. So you strip down and rub yourself down with snow in -18. And although it sounds very cold, it's not actually as bad as it sounds, because the sun can be quite strong.
We'll take your word for it.
Yeah.
How much of a help or a hindrance is the weather and the light in Antarctica?
Obviously, yeah, it can be quite a big hindrance. But I think the thing that you have to remember is you almost always get the best shots when you have bad weather and it's changing. And so I think, although, yeah, you get the conditions can change quite a lot in Antarctica, and those give some great photographic opportunities.
some quite strange effects as well. Tell us what's going on in this image here. What's this halo that we get?
Yeah, that's called a 22-degree halo, and it's basically ice crystals blown up by the wind in Antarctica that then reflect the sun's light in different ways. For some reason, it always, I don't know, maybe somebody will be able to explain to me, but it's always 22 degrees around the sun. But it's an incredibly beautiful thing to see.
And another lovely image, this one here, that looks like sort of a sunset almost.
Yeah, so actually, obviously, you've got 24-hour daylight in Antarctica, so the sun's never dipping beyond the horizon. But here it looks like it is. The sun's actually high up in the sky, but it's the reflection from the sun's rays being reflected by, there's probably on the horizon a bit of a storm, and the winds are blowing up the ice crystals and reflecting the sun's light.
Now you're there to document the expedition, but how much do you get involved in other aspects? You must have to pick up all sorts of skills.
Yeah, I think that's being on expedition. You have to sort of be ready to muck in with everything that goes on. Here, taking ice core samples, you have to be ready to muck in with anything that's going on. So you end up having to be able to do most things, turn your hand to things. Yeah.
And when you're heading out on an expedition, how much do you have a photograph already in mind, or do your pictures tend to be a bit more spontaneous?
I think it's probably a mixture of both. You can have an idea of what you want to get, but obviously you're always reacting to what the people are doing, and what the weather's doing. So although you can have an idea of what you want, when you actually get out there and start working, quite often that can be quite different.
What is it you think that you're trying to capture with your shots? Do you have a sort of an overall theme, do you think?
I think, yes. Someone, I didn't really know, and then somebody a couple of years ago said that it was loneliness was the theme that sort of featured in all my images. And I think maybe thinking about that is true. I think it's that kind of, there's a sense of isolation you get when you go to remote or wild places, whether it's Bodmin Moor here or Antarctica. And I think I try and communicate that to people, which not everybody's able to experience that in the modern day. So I think that's something that I try and communicate. Yeah.
It definitely comes through.
Do your favourite images, or are they always the ones that are sort of given the most praise, or is it different? Are the ones you like the ones that? How do you choose?
Yeah, no, I don't know why. I think obviously sometimes, I think probably all photographers fall to this bit, is that you can have an image that you love because it's taken you a lot of work to get it, and so you kind of, every time you look at it, goes all the effort that went into getting that image. But often people like an image that kind of you just saw happening and just grabbed it very quickly. So definitely, I think I have my favourite images are not always the same as other people's. Yeah.
On that same basis, how did you choose the photograph that you entered?
So you entered, I think I entered 10, you entered 10 pictures in, so I actually entered the wider shot as well into the competition. We got through the first round, but then it was, in the end, it was only the sort of closer up of the avalanche that the judges chose. But yeah, you spend quite a bit of time sort of deciding which images to put in and which to enter into each category, because obviously there's, I think, 8 different categories that you can enter into. So, yeah.
Yeah, the judges don't always go for the images that you think they're going to go for.
No, yeah, I think I actually prefer the wider shot. I think it looks more dramatic, but yeah, it's who am I to argue?
Now, the light in your images is one of the most striking things. Is that something you try hard to capture?
Yeah, that's a massive compliment. I think Ansel Adams' work is a sort of huge influence. I think any photographer, landscape photographer, looks at his work, and that's probably the sort of pinnacle of what you can do. But yeah, I think all photographers will will say that light is one of the most important things in their work, and often they call it chasing the light. You might have heard photographers talk about chasing the light, which sounds very romantic. But if you're in Scotland, let's say, where this is taken, you see the conditions changing and you're desperately trying to get up to the top of that mountain before they change, sort of sweating, carrying heavy kit, and then you see something else happening, so you're trying to move over to get that. So the reality maybe isn't as romantic as it does sound.
Do you have a favourite location to photograph?
I think probably actually the UK or Iceland are some of my favourite locations, just because the weather can change so quickly. It's constantly moving, so you can two landscapes within the space of sort of half an hour or so could be completely different. And in Iceland, I think they say if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes, and then you will. So.
Do we have any questions from our audience at all?
What's your favourite photograph?
I think actually maybe that one that we saw of Bodmin Moor. I think that's definitely one of my favourite photographs. Yeah, but again, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Sometimes people prefer the sort of more dramatic. I think one of the best reaction I get is the one that was on the front, as you guys came in, the tent with the Milky Way. But yeah, I think I prefer the one of Bodmin Moor. Yeah.
We've got a question here.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I should have said. So no, I wasn't climbing with them. The climb they were doing was way beyond anything I would be able to do. I mean, they're some of the best climbers or best British climbers that we have. But no, I was actually out there. So the idea was to be able to get some shots of them on their acclimatization climbs, but also to film them from a drone. So we specially adapted a drone that would be able to fly at that altitude, because a normal drone wouldn't be able to deal with the thin air that high at sort of 7,000 meters. And so I was out there, hopefully the idea had been to film them from a drone as they made this climb. But unfortunately, just before they started their climb, we got a call from the Pakistani Air Force, who control much of that area because it's so close to the Indian border, saying that although they'd given permission for us to fly at the beginning of the expedition, while we were at base camp, they reviewed it and decided actually that we wouldn't be allowed to film after all, which was quite frustrating. But then I sort of, for a time, I was sort of slightly annoyed about that. But then I got the image that got into the Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition. So, yeah, they did. So they got up. They basically, the climb they would have to do was a north face up to 7,000 meters, and then they'd have a ridge climb, sort of traversing a ridge for about 1 kilometer before a 200-meter sheer technical climb at the end, and all that at 7,000 meters. So, and they'd never know on the ridge traverse whether they'd be able to get back something that they'd climbed down, which I thought sounded pretty crazy. But they got up the north face at the beginning, but by that time they'd lost the weather window, and so they had time to. They climbed the western summit of Linksar, which had never been climbed either, but I think took the wise decision not to take on the ridge and the main summit with the weather worsening.
Any other questions? Oh, yep, hand up here.
Do you choose where you go?
No, not often. No, normally it's sort of other people decide and they call you up and say, would you be free to go here for this long? So you yeah. I guess quite often, sometimes you'll have two expeditions that overlap, so you have to decide which one. But no, people are deciding where you go normally.
But the Himalayas and Antarctica, not too bad.
No, yeah, I'm not complaining.
Is there anywhere in the world you would like to go, anywhere you'd like to photograph that you haven't?
I don't know about location. I think I'd love to go I'd love to do more wildlife photography. I'd love seeing the work of all the wildlife photographers in the exhibition. And I've been going to the exhibition since I was young, sort of being inspired by that. So I think I'd like to do more wildlife photography, and hopefully maybe later this year or next year, we'll be trying to do some of that. Maybe enter into the competition
Absolutely,
again.
keep entering.
Yeah.
And
What's your favourite image this year?
ooh, good
my
question.
favourite image this year, I think probably it's the I can't remember her name, the young American photographer. It's the fox with his head in the snow. Either that or the one of the Arctic fox with the egg in its mouth. I think that's an incredibly powerful image, looking straight down the lens, which.
Just like snow.
Yeah. That is true. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
There's definitely a theme here, isn't there? And just finally, we've got a couple of minutes. Do you have any tips for any budding photographers in our audience?
Yeah, I think the thing to do is just to keep shooting, keep taking photos and making mistakes. I think if you have a camera, put it on manual if you possibly can, and take photos. And quite often the photos won't look like you want them to, but then take the time to think, why doesn't that photo look like I want it to, and try and work that out. And eventually, if you do that enough, it'll become second nature, thinking about shutter speed or ISO or anything like that. And that means you're able to sort of go out and make those changes very quickly. And then secondly, I think if you see a photo that you like, try and deconstruct it and work out why you like it and what are the things that make it speak to you. And then steal those things and use them in your own work.
Absolutely, that's good advice. Well, Paddy, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It's been an
thank you for having
absolute
me.
pleasure. Some stunning images as well. Long may it continue. Thank you very much for coming down to see us today and for all of your questions. If you've enjoyed our talk, do come and see us again. We're here every Friday, Saturday and Sunday, usually with a scientist, but sometimes with a photographer as well. So keep an eye on our website. Before you go, can you all join me in thanking Paddy?